Imagine waking up to a breaking news alert saying the president's about to fire the FBI director, and by lunchtime you're looking at a smiling photo of both men together in the Oval Office. For a lot of people, that whiplash is starting to feel normal. Headlines scream one thing, reality shows you something very different a few hours later. Now add a second story where a jury looks at mounds of evidence and convicts a man in a multi-million-dollar Medicaid fraud scheme, only for a judge to step in and erase the verdict. And over all of this, the national debt passes $38 trillion, while politicians in Washington argue more passionately about a foreign war than about whether you can afford a mortgage or a doctor's visit. If you feel like the system is wobbling, you're not crazy. These stories are not just random scandals. They connect to something deeper about how power, information, and accountability work in this country. We're going to walk through what actually happened with the FBI rumor, the Minnesota fraud case, and that viral quote about caring for Ukraine while America burns at home. By the end, I want you to decide for yourself whether these are isolated mess-ups or symptoms of a bigger pattern. Because underneath the noise, the common thread is trust. Can you trust what you're told about who is getting fired inside the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country? Can you trust that when a jury says guilty in a $7 million fraud case, that verdict will stand? And can you trust that your leaders are at least half as passionate about your rent, your hospital bill, and your neighborhood as they are about borders on another continent? That's the journey we're going on together in this video. We're going to slow down, line the facts up on the table, and ask some uncomfortable questions. If you've ever looked at the news and thought, do they think we're not paying attention? This one is for you. So take a breath, maybe grab a coffee, and let's dig in. I'm your host, and around here we try to make sense of the chaos without screaming, without worshiping any politician, and without treating you like you're stupid. This channel exists to take the big, messy stories of politics, law, and money and break them down into something you can actually use to think more clearly about your own life. We look past the team jerseys, we dig under the talking points, and we ask what all of this actually means for ordinary people trying to live, work, and raise families. If that sounds like the kind of conversation you've been missing, you're in the right place. Before we go further, a quick request. If you find value in this kind of long-form breakdown, hit like so more people see it, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. And when you finish the video, I want to hear your take in the comments, especially if you disagree with me, because that's how we keep each other honest. All right, let's start with the FBI story, because it tells us a lot about how narratives are born in Washington. The basic claim was simple. The president was supposedly considering firing the FBI director, a man he had chosen specifically to clean up the bureau. The report said advisors were quietly talking about a replacement, hinting that the director had become a liability after a string of ethics questions. On paper, that sounds plausible enough in this town, and that's exactly why it spread so fast. A major cable network ran with anonymous sources who said the director was on thin ice. The wording was very careful, not he will be fired, but people familiar with the discussion say he could be fired. That kind of phrasing lets the network have it both ways, because if nothing happens, they can say, well, plans change. Meanwhile, the story ricochets across social media and people start debating a firing that hasn't even happened. Now, here's where things get strange. Within about a day, reporters on the presidential plane asked him directly, "Are you planning to get rid of your FBI director?" The president's answer was the exact opposite of the narrative. He said the man was doing a great job and brushed off the story. Then, as if to underline the point, the communications team posted a cheerful photo of the president and the director together in the Oval Office, the supposed dead man walking sitting inches from the boss. To supporters of the administration, that image was proof that the rumor was nonsense. To skeptics, it was spin, a way to paper over some internal tension they still believed existed. But no matter which side you were on, one thing was clear. The public had just watched a full media cycle built on anonymous whispers collapse into a staged photo op. And that kind of whiplash does something ugly to people's willingness to believe anything the next time. Keep that feeling in your mind as we pivot to Minnesota. Their prosecutors laid out a Medicaid fraud case that sounded like something out of a crime show. A couple ran a home health company without a real office, filing mountains of bills for services that, according to investigators, often never happened. The total alleged haul, more than $7 million drained from a program meant for vulnerable, low-income patients. Jurors sat through weeks of testimony and documents that prosecutors said showed bogus hours, non-existent visits, and money flowing into private pockets. They heard about cash withdrawals, luxury purchases, and a business that lived on paper more than in reality. After deliberating, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on the key counts against the man at the center of the case. For most people following along, that would sound like justice doing what it's supposed to do. But that's not where the story ended. Months later, the trial judge issued a long written opinion tearing apart the state's case. She argued that the proof was too circumstantial, that the government hadn't ruled out the possibility that another family member was the real mastermind, and that this defendant might have been more of a front than a driver. On that basis, she overturned the jury's verdict and entered an acquittal. Imagine how that feels if you're a taxpayer in that state, or a nurse who actually struggles to deliver care. You sat through press conferences about how this case was a slam dunk. You watched a jury say guilty, and then a single judge says, in effect, you didn't prove it well enough. Some legal experts applauded her for being rigorous about standards of proof, which absolutely matter in a free society. Others saw it as one more example of a system that seems very forgiving when white-collar crimes touch government money. And while that fight plays out in the courts and legal blogs, another argument is simmering in the background. Investigators and commentators have pointed for years to patterns of welfare fraud in that state, from bogus food programs to shady housing schemes. Some allege that chunks of that money have been moved overseas through opaque money channels, possibly flowing into conflict zones and into the hands of violent groups. Other investigators insist most of it is just good old-fashioned greed, with the money ending up in real estate, businesses, and comfortable lifestyles. Whichever version you believe, here's the common denominator. Billions are being poured into anti-poverty and health programs, and not all of it is reaching the people it's intended for. So when a big fraud case gets knocked down at the last moment, people don't just shrug it off as a technicality. They look at their tax bill, at the waiting list for services, and they ask whether the system is quietly stacked to forgive the right kind of criminal. And whether deliberate or not, that perception eats away at trust. Now, layer on top of that the national conversation about priorities. In the same political season when these stories were unfolding, the federal debt blows past $38 trillion. Interest payments alone swell to the point where they rival or even exceed what the country spends on its entire military. Yet the loudest, most passionate debates in the Capitol are not about the debt or the housing market or Medicaid fraud, but about how many more billions to send overseas. That contrast is what drove one high-profile politician to post a blunt message on social media. He basically said, look at how wild people in Washington get over this one foreign policy issue while our own country is buried in problems. He called that level of obsession insane and said it disgusted him that more passion isn't directed at fixing homegrown crises. Whether you love him or hate him, you can't deny the line hit a nerve because millions of ordinary people feel the same disconnect. So let's zoom out and do a big picture reset. On one side, you have a story about a supposed imminent firing at the top of the FBI built on unnamed sources and undercut by the administration's own photo op. On another side, you have a fraud case where a jury says guilty, but a judge says not proven enough in a state already scarred by big welfare scandals. Hovering over both is a sense that the people in charge of information and the people in charge of justice are living in a different reality than the people paying the bills. Meanwhile, the financial backdrop is brutal. Housing prices have raced ahead of income so fast that many first-time buyers have simply given up, especially in big cities and fast-growing suburbs. Mortgage payments, even when interest rates ease a bit, still swallow a giant chunk of a typical paycheck, putting homeownership out of reach for younger families. Renters aren't spared either, as monthly rents eat up income that might have gone to savings or education. In healthcare, the picture isn't much better. On paper, reforms expanded coverage, and plenty of charts show more people technically insured, but monthly premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket costs remain painfully high for anyone who doesn't qualify for heavy subsidies. People are grateful not to be locked out of the system completely, yet they dread opening the envelope that shows what their insurance will cost next year. Crime adds another layer of complexity. Official numbers in many places show that the worst spikes of the pandemic years have eased, especially for certain violent offenses. But statistics on a spreadsheet don't erase the videos people see on their phones or the stories their neighbors tell. So even when some indicators move in a better direction, the lived experience for many is that the world feels less stable, less predictable, and less safe than it used to. All of that is the stage on which these three stories play out. A rumor of an FBI firing that fizzles, a fraud conviction erased, and a blunt warning that Washington's emotional energy is pouring overseas while the home front frays. If you look at them as isolated incidents, you might shrug and move on. But if you connect them, they start to sketch a deeper crisis, a crisis of information, a crisis of accountability, and a crisis of priorities. Let's talk first about the information crisis. When a major news outlet runs a story based almost entirely on unnamed officials, they're asking you to trust them more than you trust your own eyes. In this case, your eyes eventually saw a president smiling with the man he was supposedly preparing to fire. Maybe that picture was staged, maybe there was tension behind the scenes, but what viewers actually saw was the gap between dramatic headline and calm denial. Anonymous sourcing has its place when real whistleblowers are exposing real wrongdoing, but when the default way of covering power becomes a parade of people familiar with the matter, the public starts to feel like they're listening to gossip rather than journalism. We all know how gossip works. It always sounds true, it always flatters the person repeating it, and it almost never comes with consequences when it turns out to be wrong. That's not a recipe for rebuilding trust in institutions that are already on thin ice. The second crisis is about accountability. Think about what we teach kids about the justice system. Evidence is presented, jurors weigh it, and verdicts reflect the community's judgment. When a judge throws out a jury's decision, there can be solid legal reasons for it, and sometimes judges are the last line of defense against lazy or abusive prosecutions. But when it happens, in a case involving millions of dollars in public funds and a program already riddled with scandal, you can almost feel the public's shoulders slump. If the government can't convincingly prove who stole $7 million from sick and poor people, what are we supposed to think? Either the prosecutors overreached and tried to make an example out of the wrong man, which is terrifying, or the courts found a way to let a guilty man off on a technical weakness, which is also terrifying. Neither option makes ordinary citizens feel like the system is on their side. And when politicians turn around and ask for more money for the same programs, there's a part of people's brains that quietly says, why should I trust you with it? The third crisis is about priorities. It's one thing for a great power to support allies or try to shape outcomes abroad. That's been part of the story for decades. It's another thing entirely when people watch leaders weep over foreign suffering while barely mentioning the fact that their own citizens are buried under debt, priced out of housing, and anxious about healthcare. When a politician calls that imbalance insane and says he's disgusted by it, you may disagree with his tone, but you understand the emotion. Because at kitchen tables across the country, people are having very different conversations than the ones on Sunday shows. They're not arguing about troop deployments or diplomatic language. They're asking, can we ever own a home? What happens if I get cancer? Will my kids be able to stay in this city? What happens to Social Security if the debt keeps exploding? When those questions get treated as background noise while giant checks are signed for another war zone, the message people hear is that their pain is optional. Now, Does that mean foreign policy doesn't matter? Of course not. The world is interconnected, and what happens overseas can hit us in energy prices, security threats, and economic shocks. But a healthy political class should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. They should be able to care deeply about injustice abroad without acting bored when talking about fraud in their own welfare programs or the price of a starter home. Here's another uncomfortable angle. All three crises feed each other. When people no longer trust the information they're being given, they tune out and power gets more unaccountable. When they no longer believe accountability is real, they assume everything is rigged, which makes them vulnerable to anyone who promises easy answers. And when they feel their priorities are ignored, they're tempted to support whoever shouts America first the loudest, even if that person has no real plan beyond the slogan. So what do these stories reveal about our systems and culture? They reveal a media ecosystem addicted to speed, drama, and anonymous whispers rather than patient, verifiable reporting. They reveal a justice system that can look meticulous on paper, yet still leave ordinary people feeling like large-scale fraud is a low-risk, high-reward game. And they reveal a political culture that treats domestic decline as a slow, boring problem and foreign conflict as the only thing worth getting worked up about. My own view, and you're free to disagree, is that the biggest danger isn't just one bad headline or one bad ruling. It's the cumulative effect of millions of people quietly deciding that nothing is real and nothing matters. Once that thought settles in, democracies don't collapse in a spectacular movie-style coup. They just erode, one shrug at a time. If there is a thread of hope, it's that more people are starting to say out loud what they see and feel, instead of pretending the stories they're told make sense. So what happens next? In the FBI saga, the most likely near-term outcome is more of the same. Leaks, denials, statements that try to have it both ways. The director will either quietly keep his job, or if he eventually does leave, every side will claim vindication. But the deeper question is whether newsrooms will learn anything from watching their big inside story crumble in public view. In Minnesota, the next steps are a little more concrete. The state is already appealing that overturned verdict, which means higher courts will now weigh in on whether the judge was right to throw out the jury's work. Lawmakers and watchdogs may use this case to push for tighter controls on how Medicaid dollars are spent and monitored, especially in home, health, and community-based programs. Depending on how aggressive they are, that could either protect vulnerable patients or unintentionally make it harder for honest providers to operate. Politically, expect the fraud cases and the judge's decision to become talking points in a much bigger argument. One side will point to them as evidence that welfare systems are hopelessly broken and should be slashed or dramatically redesigned. The other will warn against demonizing entire communities or services because of the actions of a relatively small number of bad actors. You and I will be stuck, as usual, in the middle, trying to separate legitimate concern from weaponized outrage. On the national stage, the clash over priorities is not going away. There will be more aid packages, more negotiations, more late-night votes about money for foreign conflicts. At the same time, there will be rising pressure from voters who are tired of hearing that there is no money for housing programs, debt relief, or healthcare reform while billions fly out the door abroad. How leaders navigate that tension will tell us a lot about whether they have heard what people like you are actually saying. For ordinary viewers, the stakes are simple but huge. If nothing changes, we drift into a world where headlines are theater, justice is a coin toss, and national priorities bear no resemblance to the problems you wake up with every day. If enough people demand better, we might still be able to nudge the system toward cleaner information, fairer accountability, and a saner balance between foreign commitments and domestic repair. That's not a guarantee, but it's still a possibility. Let's land this plane. The FBI rumor that evaporated, the Medicaid fraud case that collapsed after a guilty verdict, and the blunt warning about misplaced passion are not random dots on a map. Together, they sketch a picture of a country where huge decisions are made in rooms you never see, justified by stories that don't always survive contact with reality. You don't have to buy into any conspiracy theory to see that something is off. What I hope you take away from this video is not panic, but clarity. You are not crazy if you feel your trust has been abused. And you are not alone if you want leaders who care as much about your mortgage, your hospital bill, and your neighborhood safety as they do about the next foreign headline. The solution is not to stop caring, but to care in a sharper, more focused way, asking better questions, rejecting lazy narratives, and holding every side to the same standard. If enough of us do that, even quietly, the people in power will eventually notice. If you watched all the way to this point, thank you for giving your attention to something deeper than a 30-second clip. Tell me in the comments where you think the biggest break in the system is right now: information, accountability, or priorities. If this breakdown helped you connect some dots, tap like so more people can find it, and subscribe with notifications on if you want more long-form commentary that treats you like an adult. I'm glad you're here. Take care of yourself and your people, and I'll see you in the next one.